Chapter 64. The cold January winds were howling outside as Marlena and Carrie sat on the couch and watched Thomas rock back and forth in his recliner. The girls were playing contentedly with their Barbie dolls in front of the fireplace. The only sound was the crackling of the flames as they danced on the logs, and the soft voices of the girls as they played their adult roles through their dolls. "Well, how about something to drink?" Marlena said at last to break the silence. "What about coffee, tea?" "Some flavored tea would be great," Carrie said, glancing at Marlena. "Would you like some help?" "Nope, my treat. Come on, girls, let's go make some goodies." The girls bounced behind their mother toward the kitchen, leaving Thomas and Carrie alone in the family room. Carrie wanted to get Thomas's attention and start talking. "So, now what do we do?" she asked hesitantly, not wanting to upset him. Thomas looked directly into her eyes and without any emotion or change in facial expression calmly said, "We go pick her up once the warrant is issued." He then relocated his stare back to the center of the room. Carrie sat somberly, her hands clasped in her lap. She was chilled to the core of her soul, although the room was warm with the blaze of the fire. She ached all over and wasn't sure if she was coming down with something or if the situation was making her feel ill. She rubbed her arms and sat in front of the fire. The warmth hitting her back was comforting, and she felt a little better. She knew Thomas was in deep pain and didn't know how to help him, but she wanted to desperately. She felt very useless, although Marlena had been able to get a prescription of tranquilizers for Thomas to keep him somewhat calm on the outside. Carrie knew he was all torn up on the inside. He sat there, staring at the floor, rocking back and forth with an eerie glare of nervousness. The sound of the doorbell broke Carrie's concentration, and she jumped. She could only see Snyder through the window and was really glad to see him. "Thank God they're here," she said to herself. She wasn't comfortable being the only one in the room with Thomas. It was hard to know what to say or do under the horrific circumstances they'd been thrown into. The girls beat Carrie to the door, so the three agents were standing in the hall when she reached the foyer. Carrie whispered softly, "He isn't doing very well. He's medicated and I'm really worried." "What the hell happened?" Owens whispered back. "We go home for the evening and all hell breaks loose?" "I know. I can't believe it myself," she said, looking back at Thomas, who hadn't moved except for that rhythmic rocking. Without a flinch, Thomas screamed at his agents, "Quit talking about me behind my back and either get the hell in here and say what you have to say to my face or leave." "See what I mean?" Carrie whispered, lowering her head and almost running to find her place back in front of the warm flames. Marlena and the girls appeared with hot jasmine tea for everyone and warmed ginger snap cookies. Marlena placed the tray on a small table and the girls nibbled on the warm, soft cookies, tightly holding their cups. "You girls sit down and be careful with your milk," Marlena softly directed with her motherly aura of authority. She offered Thomas the first cup of tea and he waved his hand to say no, but Marlena gave him the "you better not object" look, so he accepted the tea and took a small sip. Carrie was grateful that the group had decided to meet at Thomas's house instead of the office because she knew Marlena could handle Thomas's deep mood swings, and things would be a little calmer and hopefully more pleasant, if that was even possible. The other agents smiled as Marlena gave them each a hot cup of tea. Although Carrie had explained the situation earlier on the phone, they were still in complete shock. The idea of Thomas's mother confessing to be a serial killer didn't make any sense, and everyone was having a hard time believing it. Dr. Thurston stood and walked to the fire. As he took a sip of tea, he spoke softly. "Thomas, perhaps there is a logical explanation. Maybe you heard her wrong." Thomas didn't move or respond to Thurston's words. The phone rang and Marlena answered it. After a few moments, she returned with the cordless in her hand. She gave it to Thomas. "It's Director Green," she said cautiously. Thomas nodded with no change in emotion, taking the phone. He paused for a few seconds to listen, then whispered, "Thank you, sweetheart," to his wife. Marlena forced a smile and turned to check on the girls. The room was quiet and everyone stared at Thomas. He sat quietly, listening to the voice on the other end of the conversation. After a few minutes, he simply said, "Thank you," and clicked the phone off. He looked callously at the small group sitting in the living room and said in a very flat and uncaring tone, "They're sending out local agents to my mother's house to pick her up. We'll be notified when she's been taken into custody." Chapter 65. Carolyn and A.J. met the car as it pulled up in front of Heritage Manor. With tears in her eyes, Carolyn looked solemnly at Maddie, who sat motionless on the front seat. As soon as the engine was turned off, Nate ran around the car and opened Maddie's door. As soon as she could, Maddie wrapped her arms around Carolyn's neck, who responded with a strong hug of support. Maddie cried helplessly in Carolyn's arms. "Thank you so much," Maddie cried. "It's so great to be back. I feel as if I'm home at last." "And that you are, my dear," Carolyn told her, fighting back the tears and stroking her head softly. "We've missed you terribly, and we've been so worried. When we received the call, we were both delighted and horrified. You know that we're always here for you." "Any other guests?" Nate asked A.J. nervously, glancing around the grounds. "Nope. As soon as we were told, we decided it best not to book anyone for a while. Give you two a chance to settle in." A.J. shook Nate's hand with a strong grip. "It's great to have you two back, my son." A big warm smile lit up A.J.'s face, and he stood firmly with his hands clasped over his stomach. "Thank you, and it's great to be back." Nate was removing their luggage from the trunk when he asked where he should park the car. As A.J. and Nate talked, Carolyn helped Maddie with her crutches, then helped her up the stairs and into the warm house. As they entered the parlor, Maddie said, "My knee is really throbbing. Can I lay down?" "Of course," Carolyn said, helping her to the couch. Maddie gingerly touched the stump of her knee. "I can still feel my calf." "Ghost limb syndrome," Carolyn said. "I'll go get us something warm to drink. You lie back and rest. You're safe here." She covered Maddie with a light quilt. "I'm glad the weather is cooperating right now. It would have been difficult making those steps if it had snowed last night. It was supposed to. Were you aware of that?" "I thought it was, but there isn't a cloud in the sky. Maybe we'll get some tonight," Maddie said, drifting off to sleep. She felt safe and warm just knowing Carolyn and A.J. were close by. The agents approached the house cautiously. 2 armed men ran around to the back while 2 stood at the front door. The ringing of the doorbell echoed through the house, and Susan rushed to get it. She opened the door slowly and stared at the 2 men who were shoving their FBI badges into her face. "May I help you?" she asked. "We need to see Madison Olson Edwards, please," one of the agents said in a very harsh but professional tone. "Well, I'm sorry, but you just missed her. She and her husband went to the mall to pick up a few things. They should be back in a couple of hours. Would you like to wait?" "No, thank you," he responded in a sharp and uncaring tone. "What mall would that be, ma'am?" "Well, everybody knows there's only one mall worth wasting your time on in this town, and it's in Oklahoma City. Take the 3rd exit into town and follow the signs. You can't miss it." "You must not be from around here, are you?" she asked, watching their strange mannerisms. "Thank you, ma'am," was all he said, and the agents left as quickly as they had appeared. Susan shook her head and closed the door. Nate watched Maddie as she slept soundly on the couch. He smiled and adjusted her quilt. He realized how much this frail, wonderful woman had changed his life for the better. He loved her with all his heart and would protect her with his life. He kissed Maddie's forehead and decided to join his friends in the kitchen while she slept. "She's asleep," Nate said as he entered the warm room. Carolyn was pouring hot water into the flowered teapot. "Poor dear, she must be exhausted," Carolyn said with love and caring in her voice. "Well then, we'll just let her sleep as long as she wants. Would you like some tea before dinner, Nate?" "I'd love some. It wouldn't be the same without your wonderful tea now, would it?" Nate smiled at them, and with tears filling his eyes, he said softly, "Thank you both so very much for everything. I don't know what we would have done if it weren't for you two." A.J. put his hands on Nate's shoulder as a gesture of support. They stood quietly staring out at the huge kitchen window, watching the trees sway in the cold January wind. wondering how long this calm would last. The agents had called ahead, and with several other agents to assist, the officer in charge handed out copies of a recent photo of Maddie and Nate. He instructed the agents to be cautious, that in all probability the couple had no idea of what was going on, and both were to be brought in safely for questioning. The walkie-talkie on the officer's belt beeped, and a voice announced that Maddie and Nate had just been spotted in a large department store. The agents dispersed to take their positions, with weapons either slung over their shoulder or secured in their holsters. Some of the patrons were beginning to sense that something was about to happen, and were stopping to watch. Maddie moaned slightly in her sleep, but Nate heard it at once. He jumped up from the kitchen table and hurried to be by her side. "Are you in pain, my love?" he whispered, brushing her hair from her eyes. With a muffled groan, she answered softly, "Just a little. I'll get your medication before I move you upstairs." He started to rise, and Maddie grabbed his arm. "No, please. I want to stay down here for a while. I want to visit with Carolyn, but some of my medication would be nice." He kissed her forehead and told her he would bring her medicine, tea, and Carolyn. Maddie smiled lovingly at her husband as he walked from the room. She felt comfortable and safe, but was wondering what was happening back home. She worried about Charlie, but knew he would be fine with his aunt and uncle. She was also worried about Toby and how he was handling everything. Maddie knew it would be many months before she would see or even speak to her boys, and that hurt her deeply. 2 agents stood at the front of the large department store that exited into the mall, while other agents covered the doors that were adjacent to the parking lots. Their walkie-talkies were going off at random, and their guns were drawn, and patrons were leaving the store in large numbers. They were rushing past the armed agents, asking each other what could possibly be going on. Most had determined that the store was being robbed, and someone had been killed. Huge crowds were forming at the exits, and the security guards were busy trying to hustle everyone away. But no one was moving from their established viewing points. In fact, more people were arriving every minute to find a good place to stand and watch what was happening. Before anyone knew it, the local news crew had arrived. A photographer from the local paper was snapping pictures, one right after the other, and the commotion was getting louder by the minute. But the agents were not paying any attention to what was happening behind them. Their only concern was the 2 individuals in the women's clothing department who were heading toward the dressing rooms. The officer in charge followed them silently so as not to bring attention to himself. His gun was secured tightly in its holster, and he had no intentions of using it unless he had to. But this was a crazy serial killer, and he wasn't taking any chances. In his 30 years with the FBI, he had been sent all over the world to bring in those on the most wanted list. He was used to putting his life on the line for his work, and this would be no exception. He wound his way cautiously through the racks of women's clothing, wondering how anyone could find a damn thing in here with everything crammed so close together. The hangers brushed against his arm, and several items fell to the floor, but he did not stop to pick them up. He was about 10 feet from the dressing room when his stomach tightened. He had seen the 2 suspects go into this area, but didn't know which room they were in. Surely the husband would wait outside like all other husbands do, he thought. But as he entered and peered down the aisle, there was no one in sight. He now walked slowly and cautiously with his gun drawn. He was ready for anything. 20 stalls, 10 on each side, lined the walls, which each door shut and locked for security reasons. He knocked on the first door. With no response, he continued down the hall, knocking first on the right and then on the left. Nothing. Where could they possibly have gone? At the end of the stalls, he noticed a door to his left that was not part of the dressing room. He turned the handle, and it opened into a small office with another door at the other side. He walked cautiously through the small office and tried the other door. He found himself stepping out into the men's section. But what alarmed him was not the quietness of the vast room. It was the door immediately to his right. He knew it was an emergency exit that led out to the back section of the mall. As he ran out the emergency exit, he grabbed his walkie-talkie and shouted that the 2 suspects had just escaped. He ran down the long, empty corridor that made a sharp right at the end. He continued to run, hearing the echo of his feet slapping onto the concrete floor. When he reached the end of the vast, empty hall, he burst through a door that opened out into an empty parking lot where he saw a car driving off in the distance. He couldn't tell who was driving or how many people were in the car. He had lost them. For the first time in his career, he had lost his suspects, and he was angry. "Damn fire exits," he yelled. Chapter 66. Marlena answered the phone cautiously. The terror in her eyes announced at once who was on the line. But Thomas never changed his gaze from the center of the room. Marlena walked slowly toward Thomas and handed him the phone. "Hello?" Thomas said. He was silent for a few moments and then replied, "Thank you. We'll be there as soon as we can." He clicked the off button. "We're to take the next flight to Oklahoma City. Seems our 2 suspects got away. Any idea of where they'll go?" He was pale and felt sick. He was pulling strength from a part of himself he never knew existed. Although he had promised his mother to be strong and do what was right, he felt betrayed and alone. His gaze continued to fix on the center of the room. No one knew what he was thinking or the status of his mind. He wasn't even sure himself. He was remembering when he was a little boy and his father, Jake, would throw him high into the air. The strong hands caught him each time just before he hit the floor. The feeling of security and safety had been strong, and he thought life was wonderful. He remembered running down grassy slopes being chased by his father. The sweet smell of grass was fresh in his mind. He could still hear his mother calling out for them to be careful. The memories filled his heart with warmth and love, and he wanted his father to help him now more than ever before. No, not his father. Thomas wanted his daddy. Where was his daddy? Where was that security? He had lost his daddy long ago, and now he was about to lose his mother. Life didn't make any sense, and he wasn't sure if he could continue. His heart was breaking, his soul was being ripped in two, and his mind couldn't think. He ached throughout his body, and he was beyond tired. There were no more tears left to cry. He was a dry, empty shell. How could life turn on him, reject him, as it has? The room was silent. The only sound was the crackling of the fire in the hearth. Marlena was adding another log and churning the embers. The agents continued to watch Thomas. There was nothing else to do. Carrie spoke first. "Are you sure this is such a good idea, Thomas? Maybe you should excuse yourself since you're so close to the situation. You know, conflict of interest." "No, I won't. I want to see this through to the end if it's the last thing I ever do. Terry, call and make arrangements for airline tickets. Marlena, would you please help me pack?" he asked with swollen eyes, longing for those earlier years when he was sure of his future and comfortable with the past. Chapter 67. The FBI agent was sitting solemnly at the police station in Oklahoma City. He was very angry and disgusted with himself for losing his 2 suspects. Never in his career had this happened, and he was not about to let this case ruin his record. He wanted the individuals in custody before the agents from D.C. arrived that afternoon. His cell phone rang and pulled him from his thoughts. He was so excited to finally be getting a call that it was difficult to open his phone. As he fumbled with the small electronic device, his partner chuckled at his boss nervously. "So even the great Devin Arville gets fickled from time to time. This is a nice change." The partner took a sip of his coffee and smiled as he watched his arrogant boss being flustered. "Agent Arville," he snapped in his phone, glaring at his partner. "Yes, we'll be right there." Arville slapped the phone shut and hollered at his other agents who were across the room. "Let's go. They found the car." Maddie woke from her sleep groggy and sore. Her body ached and she was worried about an infection. Carolyn went to Maddie and brushed the hair from her eyes. "Anything I can get for you, sweetheart?" she asked with genuine concern and care. Maddie's forehead felt warm. "I need some aspirin or something. Do you know where Nate is?" She felt weak and sickly. Her mouth was dry. "He's in the kitchen, dear. I'll go get him at once." Maddie slowly pulled herself up on the couch. She ached terribly, but her thoughts immediately went to Toby and Charlie. She was worried about her two boys and desperately wanted to call and tell them the truth, tell them everything, but she knew she couldn't do that. It would be too risky and would jeopardize their safety. She began to cry. It felt good to get her emotions out, even though it seemed she had been crying constantly for the last several weeks. Nate was soon at her side, feeling her forehead. She was hot. His worst fears had materialized. Maddie was running a fever. "I've got some antibiotics the doctor gave me just in case," he said. "I'll go get them." He stood, and Maddie grabbed his hand and pulled him to her. "What is it, sweetheart?" Nate asked. "I'm not sure if I can do this, Nate." Maddie's body began to tremble. "I need my boys. I don't think I can go through with this." She cried harder. "Mad, honey," Nate begged. "We don't have any other choice, sweetheart. I know this is difficult," Maddie yelled at him for the first time in their relationship. "Don't patronize me. I've been through hell these last few weeks, and for what? For what?" With tears rolling down her face, she screamed, "Would you mind explaining all of this to me again? Because my heart just isn't accepting any of this." She lowered her head and sobbed into her hands. Nate sat silently next to her, not knowing what to say or how to comfort her. Carolyn and AJ stood quietly, listening from the next room. They felt helpless and sorry for Nate and Maddie, but they knew there was nothing they could do either. The car was located at the end of a long, dark alley in the heart of Oklahoma City. The doors had been left ajar, and there was nothing inside. When Arvil arrived, the local uniformed police were milling about, looking totally confused and bewildered as to why they were checking out an abandoned car legally parked in an alley. As he walked toward the men, who were scratching their heads and complaining to each other, Arvil flashed his FBI badge. "Okay, gentlemen, we'll take it from here. Who's in charge?" "Officer Brio, sir," a young man answered, pointing toward the car with the flashing lights. Arvil thanked him and approached the officer, who was obviously talking to his dispatcher on the radio. "Excuse me, are you Officer Brio?" Arvil interrupted. Irritated, the officer looked up. "Yeah, who wants to know?" Once again, Arvil flashed his badge. "I do." He frowned at the man, who looked angrily back at him. "Well, you've got him," Officer Brio grunted, not budging from his seat inside the car. "What else do you want? We found your car, and there was no one here." "Any idea of where they might have gone?" "Your guess is as good as mine," Brio said, shrugging his shoulders and trying hard to ignore this person who was annoying him. "Well, thanks," Arvil said sarcastically. "We'll take it from here. I'll be in contact if we need anything else." He turned to his team of agents and began to give out orders to search for any signs of the missing couple. "Suit yourself," Brio responded. Shaking his head in disbelief, he turned to one of his men and winked. The officers climbed back into their squad cars and left the FBI agents with their suspect's empty car. On his way back to the station, Brio used his cell phone to call in his report to Executips Incorporated.